think back, where did I find my collaborative groups in those early stages? So I'm working at a Christian Counseling Center in Grand Rapids, Michigan, a nonprofit. And if you know anything about Grand Rapids, it's a little bit of a Christian mecca, kind of like Colorado Springs and other places. So we would get our share of missionaries coming back as casualties. And I had one of those moments that Leanne just talked about. Meeting with a woman, her husband was very, very successful church planter. He was doing a great job. She was the mother of 3 little children. She came to my office. She was extremely depressed. She stayed with the children, and her husband went back to the field. He was thriving there. She was not. And she told me about kind of the way that when the pastoral support people came, the member care people came, their organizational people came, she talked about how they could put on a really good front, that everything is going super well. But here she's sitting in my office, and she's extremely depressed. And one of the normal questions we as practitioners will ask is like, who is your support structure? Where are you going to go? You're back here in Grand Rapids, you got 3 small kids. I say, do you have supporting churches? Do you have friends? Do you have family? And you know what? She looked at me with a very depressed affect, and she said, I can't tell anybody what's going on with me. It will totally ruin this whole thing that my husband's doing, and he's thriving. And I had one of those moments where it's like, no, this is so wrong. If this is how we as a church are going to relate to missionaries, this is not good. So that actually was a pivotal moment for me to say, what do I do? Many of you are asking that same question. And so where do I find this collaborative group? And I learned about something called Mental Health and Missions. It happens yearly, the week before Thanksgiving every year. And it happens in North Indiana, which is a close for me to go to. And I went, and it was like, I want to network and find the people that know how to do what I feel like we have to do in terms of supporting missionaries on the field. And this is back in the late 90s. I don't know, Ann, were you in the system back then?
I started in 94.
Okay, so this is about 98, 97 that I had this kind of awareness that I got to do something. And so that has led me on the journey that led me to ending up in Chiang Mai and being part of the process of starting the Cornerstone Counseling Center there. So I just share that with you that we all have these pivotal moments that push us to a place to say, what can I do, God? What must I do? And those are great questions to ask. And some of you might be there, some of you are further on in your journey. You have more experience in areas, and you're trying to say, what do I do next? And those are all great, great questions. So what I want to share with you now is on the ground as a practitioner, giving you a perspective of what I have learned from working with an organization. And I'll give you a little history about that organization that I'm going to highlight and why I'm choosing that. But first of all, I made this title. We were kind of in an evolution process coming up with titles, and so I like this title. But trauma-informed right now, you hear that phrase a lot. So then I'm thinking trauma-informed staff care is essential for high-risk organizations. And high-risk organizations can be anything from like a Red Cross that has thousands of volunteers to relief and development organizations, humanitarian organizations, mission organizations, NGOs, anybody that is wanting to have some contact with the world of trauma. So I'm thinking like, why is it important that these organizations are trauma-informed? So I'm going to actually give you, through my experience, what I've learned about this. But first of all, in terms of being trauma-informed, I had to think, and Kelly was pushing me a little bit to think this way yesterday. Why do I believe this? Why is this a core value for me? One is I have learned that with the senior leadership, and that includes a board of directors, if they basically endorse that staff care is high value for our organization, it's going to mean a great deal difference than those organizations that don't endorse staff care at that higher level. So I find that exceedingly important and fundamental to this whole process is you've got to get at the senior leadership and hopefully you have access to the board of directors making decisions about the organization. Does that make sense to you? It's very, very important. The other point is that from a leadership development point of view for those leaders on the field, my belief and high value is if they are leading well, if they are leading from a place of building resilience with their team, if they're leading from a place that's integrating this whole concept of being trauma-informed into their process of leading a field office, making decisions based on trauma-informed data and evidence that we have, and then also if they are modeling the healthy work-life balance, if I have my leaders on the field setting that as a high priority and value, then I'm going to have healthy teams. So, I mean, just really basic common sense has put me to a place of realizing that how incredibly important it is that we have trauma-informed staff care procedures within organizations. So, I'm focusing more, and I use this phrase, high-risk organizations, and I mentioned many of those. Most organizations have risk factors if they're out there doing this kind of work, but the organization that I'm highlighting for you is the International Justice Mission. So you'll hear me say IJM, abbreviation for that, it's easier to say. If you got the information about preparing for this, I put on there that you would listen to a TED Talk from Gary Haugen, the founder of IJM, and he talks about why it's very, very important to look at this whole issue of violence against the poor and how we must address those issues if we're going to get anywhere in bringing a just world to the poor. If you listen to that, it can help you kind of set the stage for where I'm coming from and giving you my personal experience for working with IJM. Just so one of the things that Gary says that stands out for me, if you listen to it, he said, basically, he divided the world into thirds. A third of the people in the world are going to have access to justice systems, law enforcement, and social welfare systems that are going to be there basically to help the whole population. Okay? A third of the world, he says, have the financial means to basically put high-level walls, hire security companies, put glass on the top of their walls, build compounds, seclude themselves from the violence outside there in the world that they are living. And then there's a third of the people that have none of that, for whom that's where the violence of the poor is going to be greatest. So when you think about that, that's a huge problem when you think about a third of the world is not going to have access to this kind of system that is going to create a sense of security for them. They're living in a constant state of vulnerability. So what happened in my story is that we lived in Chiang Mai in 2001 to 2007. And 2004, I met the field director for IJM in Chiang Mai. At that time, they were doing trafficking of minors, especially if you know that part of Thailand. North Thailand has all these hill tribe areas, and basically traffickers knew to go into these villages and say to the parents, I can bring your daughter to Chiang Mai, we can give her a place to work and a place to stay, and I will give you X amount of money to, so that we care about her and we're going to support her. Bring her into Chiang Mai or send her to Pattaya, South Thailand or somewhere, and she becomes a sex slave. That's what was going on at that time in Chiang Mai. So there was a highly vulnerable group up there in the hill tribe people in North Thailand. So the field director, whose name is Sean Litton, he's now the president of IJM in Washington, D.C. He comes to me, and he's quite a dramatic person, and he just says, Tim, we're way out of our ballpark. things are not going well with our rescues. It's a mess. We're really struggling. And he says, what can we do? What can we do? And I remember pulling out my member care books at that time and saying, you guys need member care. And so at that point, I had something to offer that was very new. This is 2004. And he thrived on that. He took that and he had me come in and consult with him and their team about, how do they handle this day-to-day stress of working with this population. It's very vulnerable and it was not going well. So fast forward to 2008, my family and I moved back to the US at this time. This man, Sean Linton, is now at headquarters in Washington, D.C. He says, Tim, this organization does not have an understanding what staff care is all about. Will you come and build our staff care program? And it was like, yes. It was like, I had no idea what that meant at the time. But it was like, I saw at this point that this could make a huge difference for me and for them. So it was a challenge that came to me. I took the challenge and decided, like, okay, we're going to do this. So just a couple pieces about that is something in me. I'm a psychologist, and as a psychologist, I knew there was this issue of chain of command and confidentiality and reporting to managers. All of these kind of issues were going in my brain, and I said to them, I do not want to be an employee of your organization. Let me be an independent contractor or an external consultant. And I think that was the Holy Spirit speaking to me, because that has been, for me in this organization, one of the very fundamental structures that I put in place from the beginning that has worked hugely to my benefit. And that the leadership knows, they have conversation with me, it's confidential. And although many of these people are attorneys, and attorneys know how to do depositions. I don't know if you've ever done depositions before. They can be pretty good at kind of keep on needling me like, oh, you said such and such. Is that related to such and such? And I just look at them and smile and say, you guys, I'm not going to give you anything specific. But they would continue, they still do that. There are certain attorneys there that still have fun with me and trying to get information from me. And it's kind of like, no, not going to do it, you guys. You know that. It would totally blow my whole role with that. So, what I want to do here for a few minutes with you, and I think I passed out handouts, and I don't know if everybody got them. Who didn't get one? Anybody else? Did you get one? Okay. Josiah. Anyone else not get one? Ladies in the back, didn't get one. Over here, you guys okay? Okay, so then, what I had fun doing is, this is an outline for you that is going to be on the screen, but if you're hearing something in here that is piquing your interest, jot down a note, because this is a basic outline, because there are some things here that you might want to have further conversation about. I did not prepare this to be, to give you all information. It was more to give you a sense of, here's a justice humanitarian organization I'm working with, and I'm trying to show you how I have developed a staff care and trauma-informed staff care model for an organization. So this is just one way of looking at it, but I think there's some principles in here that you can utilize in many different settings. So first of all, what I decided to do is that, let me backtrack a second. This is just showing you, to give you a little history of IJM, where they are doing their justice work around the world and their partnership offices. So these are the places that I'm working to support the IJM team around the world. And just want to make this moment too for you that justice for the poor has resulted in these typical casework that they are doing around the world. So modern day slavery is a big deal. For example, that in India there are I can't remember that, it's like 20 to 25 million slaves in India in itself. IJM says that right now there are more slaves in the existing world than there were when slaves were being moved from Africa around the world. So there are actually more slaves existing now. So slavery works in typical settings like bonded labor, where people say they need money, so they go to the brick kiln owner and they say to the owner, I need so-and-so money for my daughter's wedding, and basically now that family is bonded to the brick kiln owner for the rest of their life, and generationally, there's been generations of families that are bonded to a specific person like that. It happens in India to this day. Slavery also goes to places like in Ghana. If you've been to Ghana, there's Lake Volta, and little boys are taken from poverty areas up on the lake, and they are brought in as slaves to do the labor on the boats. Slave labor is happening in the region surrounding Thailand. Interestingly, Walmart is wanting to do something about that, and they have given IJM a grant to try to reduce the refugees, illegals that get pulled into doing the slave work in the fishing industry. So slave goes to many different categories. There's the sexual violence issues. Many countries, there's impunity, meaning that there's no accountability for sexual abuse toward children. A lot of Latin American countries, this is very, very prevalent. Police abuse of power. Unfortunately, our Nairobi is a big part of that, and I think it's going to be 3 years this June. IJM lost 3 people through torture and murder, and right now the case is still going on in the courts because I think there's 5 to 10 people who are being prosecuted, and they're all from the police department. That they have evidence that the police department was part of murdering, and one of the guys that was murdered was a client who was bringing a case against the police. So think about trauma, and think about systems where you can't trust the law enforcement. Illegal property seizure is a big issue. It's kind of an issue in Africa where a woman is widowed, and she and her children are thrown off the property by her husband's family or neighbors. Lastly, in the hill tribe area of Thailand, nobody up there has proper citizen rights, which means they have no right to land, to job, to citizen, to identity card, or anything. So all of these, when you think about them, come from people being vulnerable, as poor in the area of poverty, like the police abuse of power. I look at Miriam in Nairobi. If somebody has been murdered, sometimes they'll just go off to the street, and if someone is in proximity to where someone was murdered, they get picked up, put in jail as a potential person who was the assailant there. So when you think about this, I wanted to share that through for IJM because, again, it's violence against the poor that perpetuates the system. And IJM has this philosophy of rescuing victims, bringing criminals to justice, restoring the survivors, and then strengthening or transforming the justice systems. So it can start with a rescue, but it leads to restoration, and then hopefully they're going to restore and transform the justice systems in that country. So now looking at the handout, I'm going to take you through this rather quickly. I wanted to look at 3 levels that I'm looking at with this organization, IJM. The first level is that is the macro level, or if I'm looking at an organization more systemically. And so this is specific to IJM. These factors to me contribute to them being high-risk organization. And so I just wanted you to kind of get a sense for why I believe and why I need to understand as their provider that they are a high-risk organization. I've already mentioned they're working in developing countries where the judicial systems are broken. People are not prosecuted for their crimes. That's called impunity, meaning that they can get away with it. There's broken law enforcement systems. Oftentimes in these countries, the police get such a low wage that the only way that they can make enough money to survive is through bribing and corrupting and hauling people in and getting paid off. So you have these corrupt systems that are not working effectively for the poor. Many of these countries, we have social welfare systems that are not adequately taking care of the victims. If they have to be pulled out and put in institutionalized settings, they're not adequately caring for the families of the victims. In these systems, it can be very difficult working with the government. IJM will only go in and work in a country where the government has invited them and they have established an MOU understanding. So IJM will not just go into Yemen and say, we're here to bring justice to your country. There has to be some kind of partnership that the government, but most of these countries have laws about these issues that they're not abiding by. And so there's this whole sense being high risk means that they're basically going to have to convince the governmental officials that this is legitimate. And an interesting case happened in Ghana. They did their first rescue of little boys. If you go back, there's some beautiful videos of rescuing those first group of little boys. And off the lake for, again, that slave trade of those boys in the fishing industry there on Lake Volta. And the first rescue didn't go well. The law enforcement was not backing them up properly. And then after that, because of government political issues, they revoked IJM's MOU to do this work. IJM then spent the next 16 months renegotiating their MOU with the organization to be able to get back on the lake to rescue these boys. So, I mean, think about that. That puts them, from a governmental point of view, in a risky situation. Lastly, IJM is a Christian organization, and somehow they've been able to bridge the gap that they get Walmarts and Googles and Buffum. They get these folks giving to the organization. Do you guys remember Stephanie Power? She went on a trip with Gary Haugen, the founder of IJM, down to Africa. She was deeply, deeply moved, but she was also deeply troubled that as a Christian organization, they were exclusive of people that they would hire into the organization. So I'm putting this as making a risk factor for the organization at that macro level, that the people out there saying, you're not allowed to be Christian in this sense. So thinking about that, then I'm thinking about what makes high risk at the team level. If I'm thinking of field office, number one, they have victims, and so victims are going to have to share their story. We call that vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma is rampant within the work that they do. Burnout, they don't have, I put in here a fluid job description. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but one day they're doing accounting, and the next night they're asked to go out and do an operation and rescue 100 victims from the brick kiln. So I call that a fluid job description. So that puts people kind of in these high-risk situations where it's like, what is my job again? Safety is obviously an issue. In India, in those earlier days, the powerful owners of these brick kilns and these companies, they were paying off the police in that area, and they also knew how to gather a mob, basically to come in and bring a mob into this rescue that was happening and frighten everybody off. And so those that were being rescued as slaves would not go with the people that were trying to bring them out. But it also meant that the workers that went in to rescue them were in danger. So there's safety issues that go along with this. And obviously the police abuse of power case in Nairobi means that if you're going to court and you're bringing a victim of police abuse of power to testify, that's exactly what happened in this case. They left the courtroom, and that's when they were abducted and taken off and were horribly murdered. So, we're talking about high risk around safety issues for the team. There's cultural sensitivity issues. If anyone knows Philippines is interesting in the dynamic of Christian Catholic. And in the offices there are wonderful Catholic and Pentecostal Christians working together. but it's interesting that culturally they make comments that sometimes are not conducive to a good team dynamic. In the Kenya office, there are people with different tribes, and it's very clear that there's some very ethnic, cultural differences with those tribes in Kenya. And I hear like these little comments. I mean, this is not expatriates. This is within the system of Kenyans. And then we throw in the whole cultural piece of expatriates coming in and maybe leading the offices and trying to raise up a national leader. Well, there's risks in doing that also. So then, thirdly, I make a big point that we look at the macro level, we look at the team level, and then we look at the individual level. So what risks are there for an individual or a family to be deployed to these places? And I found this very, very important as an organization that we look at, when we're deploying anybody to a new assignment that's bringing them into a new culture, as an organization, it's very, very important to do proper preparedness and not think of them just as an employee that you're deploying, but the employee has a family, you're deploying the whole family. And I made that a really, really prominent point of saying, your employee is only going to be able to transition and adjust well to this new culture and setting if their family is being supported. I got some real pushback on that initially. The initial HR director, this is back in 2008, said to me, but we didn't hire the whole family. And I said, yes, you did. And I was adamant on that point that you bring a expatriate into one of your settings, and they have a family, and this whole family has to move into that setting. The whole family now has to be taken care of and well supported. That was an initial piece that I really pushed on. So there's need for cross-cultural competency and preparedness for families who are deployed, preparedness of individual and family for deployment and critical incident response, and then work-life balance. It's interesting, IJM tends to attract a very high, competent, professional group of people who want to work for the organization. People who are the cream of the crop in their legal offices or as social workers or working undercover. One of the former NCIS directors was head of investigation for IJM at one point. And so they get the cream of the crop. But what happens then is they get deployed to the field and they're no longer just an attorney. They're no longer just a social worker. So you have these issues of like, all of a sudden, they're a government liaison. They're there to care for their team as a shepherd because the spiritual formation part of it is essential in the IJM culture. They're having to lead their teams. They're having to do, their job description all of a sudden went from one focus as an attorney to all of a sudden they have to be a jack of all trades and leading office that's very culturally sensitive to what's going on. It's a very, very difficult job to do. So this work-life balance is a very important thing. So real quickly, I just wanted to go through with you in the early stages of coming in 2008, I was asked to do a needs assessment, and then prepare what I thought would be a comprehensive staff care program for them. So I tried to do the research as best as I could, talk to people, and these are some of the outcomes that I came up with that to me were essential at the beginning. Number one, and most of you I think have already heard this, is that they as an organization, at this time in 2008, they were only 11 years into this organization structure, so they were relatively young still. Excuse me. But they were functioning totally as a reactive, crisis-oriented organization. In those early months, I had a phone call from one of the vice presidents, and I'm listening to this, and this was one of their expat leaders, and I'm going, this sounds very much like a paranoid psychotic break that this person is going through on the field. And the vice president saying, what do we do, what do we do? And I'm going, first of all, I'm thinking like, how could this happen? Was my response. It's like, how does someone get to the point of being paranoid and psychotic and delusional when they're leading an office out there in the field? And I was just like, I wanted to, just go back, like, well, how did that happen if I couldn't do that? So it's like we had to come up with a crisis plan, which, in crisis situations is part of a role that I could have. But in this case, it's like, no, this is went way too far before there was any kind of intervention. So I made that my top priority. It's like, you must move from a reactive organization to a proactive organization. That to me was essential, and I kept on talking that. And again, these are really smart people that I'm dealing with, but the number of times I would repeat some of these things to them over the course of the 11 years, there's some of these things that I continue to have to say again and again. And I've just learned that that's my role in being the voice to say these things again and again. I went through, some of those years I went through the frustration of like, are they ever going to, learn this? Or are they ever going to get this? And I'm going, I kind of let that go and just said, okay, I have to continue to be the voice. Is finally where I got to that place. Secondly, there was no pre-deployment preparedness for sending out people to the field that were not from that country. There was no dealing at all with cultural competencies. That to me was also a high need. And this third one I've already mentioned, that families were viewed as an extension of the IJM employee. Fourthly, they were lacking integrative staff care model from the board of directors, senior leadership at headquarters, and field office leadership. One of the things is that they hear me say again and again, you have to build in staff care into the DNA of the organization and the culture. And so that's what I mean by an integrative model. You don't just attach staff care as this nice thing that we do for people as a human resource benefit, that if they get into trouble, then staff care comes in. I say consistently, you must weave this into the DNA of the organization. There was no contingency planning for critical incident events. There was no mental health debriefing for workers with high exposure to trauma. And there was no transitional debriefing for leaders deployed to new locations or exit debriefing for leaders leaving the organization. People left basically like mission organizations. They were casualties, and there were a lot of casualties in those early years in this organization, because that's the only way they knew how to respond to their staff. They worked really hard, and they ended up as casualties. Yes, Pat?
Yeah, I just have a question for you, Tim. So, did you have to make adjustments or suggest adjustments in the assessment of new people applying to be part of IJM? And was there a lot of tightening up that you felt needed to be done, even if they didn't do it?
That story is still being written.
Oh,
yeah. And I'll get that into the next piece here. So these were the findings. They're pretty general here. Hopefully you can see that these translate to a lot of organizations that are doing high-risk work. So let me get into now the strategies, what I have been working on. These strategies here, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. These were the macro levels. I had to, as a mental health professional, I had to understand what it meant to work within a broken justice system, what it meant to work with a corrupt police force, what it meant, that there's children being rescued and then put in a social welfare home where they're sleeping on the floor. I had to know and understand that this is what these people have to deal with in their work until they can get a transformational process going. Do you hear what I'm saying here? I couldn't go in and just do my thing as a professional without really knowing and understanding what it meant for those field workers to be working this way. And I'm going to give you an example of that in a minute. So I'm just going to, you can refer back to this. IJM initially was doing more rescue operational casework. They have changed they're in the process, I should say, of transforming their whole system, that instead of hiring more people representing IJM in these countries, they're saying we have to build partnerships, and so we're gonna look for the existing organizations that have an ethos similar to IJM, and we're gonna teach them our model of change. And that has happened with the Google grant in India. They have, in the last 3 years, done amazing in building partnerships with this whole area of human trafficking and bonded labor. And so they're teaching others who now have resources in those places. So I had to know and understand the organizational at the macro level for me to really work effectively. So at the team level, this is where I want to just talk through some of these things. I have been a real strong advocate that every field director leader has to have a wellness and resilience plan. Do you know what I mean by that? Is that they actually have to sit down and I give them a template to work with. This is your self-care plan. How are you going to be able to handle the work that you're confronted with? And so to me, that was a very important piece that it's still in process, but I've made a lot of headway there. Secondly, in all of these offices, what happened was that we thought we could hire external counselors or vet external counselors that lived like in Mumbai and India, who the staff could go to for more direct services. Because somebody like me can't travel all over the world to take care of 800 people. So we were looking to vet. What we found, and I think Miriam, is that in many of these countries, and we actually did a study, Miriam, in the study I say to them, if you talk to your friends out in the community about what is mental health, you know what they say? They say, crazy. People are crazy. I mean, the word mental health equals crazy. So what that means, that there's a risk factor there, that we can't just vet this really nice professional counselor out in the community and expect the staff, the local staff, to go see them because of the high-risk work that they do. So that's been a piece, and one of the pieces of the puzzle we've done is that we'll bring pastors or a counselor in, and we integrate them into the office system. They might come in and do a devotional once a month. They might come in twice a month and just be available for people on a very informal, casual basis that everybody knows why they're there. They know they're confidential. And we have found that a lot of these offices bringing in that person to the office, and partly too, then that person understands the mission of IJF. So in many of these places, it didn't work to send them out. There are some places in the world that it has worked, but most of the IJM locations, especially like Africa, it does not work. So that was a piece. Contingency planning for critical events affecting the team. That's, I've been working with them consistently to think about what is a critical event that could happen to your team and how do we prepare for that. And one of the reasons why I visit all of the teams is that I said, if I'm called in at an emergency deployment to come to your team, I want your team to already know me. And when I come into the teams, I never say to them, I'm here as a psychologist, I'm here as a counselor, I'm here to do debriefing. I don't even use those words anymore. And maybe that's not right. But you know what I do? I come in and say, I want to know what this organization really needs to do to care for you. What does that look like? And for you and your job, what does that look like with you living in this culture, for you and your family? And then you know what? They tell me all the things that I would want to know. They do their debriefing with me when I ask that question. And I remember in India I went and they were all told that they had to meet, all of the casework people had to meet with Tim, and they had never met me before. And one of the women who was a little bit more bold, she says to me, she says, I don't know why I'm meeting here with you. I mean, they told me I had to meet with you. And I just looked at her and said, you don't have to meet with me. And I think I kind of caught her off guard. And then I said, but it would really be helpful for me to understand what is the stress, how does your work affect you, educate me about your job, how can we help you as an organization? And you know what? Diffused everything, and she did what would be a traditional debriefing kind of conversation at that point. So just trying to give you, there's some ways into this, but I've had to learn how to change my approach. The debriefing model for operations that involve exposure to clients, and the next one, a safeguard program. What There are IJM employees that every day have to listen to the stories of their victims, and that's part of their work. And so we want to have a debriefing structure for them that is adequate. But they have raised the standards, and I don't know if you know this, but there's something called online sexual exploitation of children. Do you know what that means? In the Philippines, where this is happening most right now, and that's where IJM's doing their work, what somebody can do is they can find a link on the dark web, and they can make contact with somebody in Philippines who, they say, I want virtually to see 2 children enacting this sex scene. So then there's a middle person, and then that middle person, goes into a community where there's usually a high degree of poverty, saying we will pay you if you you bring your children in. And so they're actually getting the parents, grandparents, aunties, friends of these children to bring them into this place where there's a computer with a camera, and the person in the US, China, Japan, Europe says, I want to see a boy and girl doing these actions. Did you guys know this is going on? I mean, this is horrendous. This is kind of taking human trafficking to another level. Think about it, because you know who is complicit in this and bringing the children are the family members. It's not a child being abducted in India, a Nepali girl who is taken and now put in a brothel. These are the parents bringing their children to somebody and leaving them there so that they can enact these sex scenes for somebody on the camera. It's very, very difficult, and so when the attorneys now have to present evidence in court within 36 hours at a hearing to actually make a case, they have to look at the scenes screen by screen and say, at such and such a place, this act happened. And never before has it been that intense in terms of the level of interaction. And what it also means, all of you who are social workers, think about what it'd be like. We're talking children like 4, 5, 6. You have to go now, and there's an operation with law enforcement. You're going to rescue these kids out of this small village. You as a social worker are there to provide the support for the child. These children have no idea that what they were doing was wrong. You're going there and you're trying to reassure them they're going to be safe with you, and you're going to take them away from their family and their village. Think about what you would feel like as a social worker when those kids are screaming and crying, and the parents are running up saying, why are you taking my children away? And in Filipino culture, you don't do those kind of things. Family is family, regardless. And these social workers, these Filipino social workers, their hearts are, they have told me, and they sob, what it is like for them to pull these children out of these situations where they have been trafficked to this kind of exploitation. So I bring that example to you. I know it's really graphic. I know you can handle hearing that, and part of it is it helps me when I share that with you guys, that other people know this is going on and can say that, like, this is so wrong. But what we had to come up with is that we had to really develop a high level of what we call safeguard program, which means how do they look at the images on the screen? What do they have? How long can they do that? They cannot listen to the sound and the pictures at the same time. How do they run through the thumbnails and not necessarily see everything? So we had to develop this whole program to try to prevent the kind of trauma that's going to go for anyone that's now going to have access to doing this work to bring a case to court. Lastly, piece, and this goes back to one of the articles I had you read about peer support. It became very evident that we have very well-qualified people working these offices, and so how do we develop a peer support structure? Michelle referred to PFA, psychological first aid. So in Africa, IJM has done their first pilot project of every field office now has 2 to 3 people identified as peer support for that team. And that means that they're available to provide basic psychological first aid. They're also, we've set them up that if we need to mobilize somebody from Ghana to go to Kenya to support the team there, instead of bringing Tim from the US, we're going to bring our 2 peer supporters from Ghana to go support the team in Nairobi. So the peer support thing is taking this to a whole nother level, that is putting it in the region and is setting up a structure here that in the office they're also understanding what it means to support each other much better. It's a really, really exciting program to be part of. Lastly, I want to take you what we had to do for the individuals and the families, and individualized self-care plans for field leaders, which addresses their personal and family needs. I've talked about that. I insist now that everybody deployed has to have a pre-deployment briefing. And right now I'm the one who is doing that with our high-level leaders that we're sending to the field. And you know what else? If they have a family, I'm doing a home visit before they deploy. Can you believe that an organization is letting me do that? But do you know how much information I gain about a family when I go visit them in their home 2 weeks before they're ready to deploy? And I can see them living in chaos. I can see as a family how they're functioning. So when they get to Africa 3 months later and something's going on, I already know them. I already could see where they're going to struggle as a family because of the home visit. What organization allows us to do that, from the financial point of view? Yes, right. I put this, I say singles, individual / family. I'm trying to make a lack of, not to separate that. The organization has implemented a structure that every 3 years, as field directors, they're required to have a debriefing, individual or family, depending on whether or not they have family. So MTI is utilized for that, Lower Shade is utilized for that. There's a place in New Zealand we've used. Transitional debriefings are required when we're moving families and field leaders to new locations. There's a global staff care consultant to provide quarterly contact with field directors, that's me. And there's crisis debriefing by global staff care consultant for critical events. So I'm brought in terms of the crisis situations. So I want to bring us to close. I know that was kind of a quick overview. Remember, my purpose and goal here was bringing you to a practitioner level, down to the level where you're being asked to create a trauma-informed system for a high-risk organization. And so there's actually a lot of spectrum there in terms of what that involves, whether it's Christian, non-Christian. And I thought what I could offer you best is kind of this 11-year journey that I've been on with IJM, and giving you some of the places where we have some major shifts that are obviously working well for the organization, but then there's some places where we get stuck again and again and again. For example, one place we get stuck is when there's an incident report that goes to a security consultant at Washington, D.C. There's an official report. So there was an armed robbery on the street. What I keep saying to them is, when security gets a report that involves any person and there's any potential risk factor to that person, that has to move right directly into our staff care system. And it's still not happening in that way very easily. We work well with security, but somehow they kind of forget about that there's going to be staff care implications for these situations. So there's still certain pieces that I continue to hear myself say again and again. And when new people come into leadership, I have to kind of go backtrack and reorient them to why we're doing what we're doing. So what we're going to do now is lunch is at...
Lunch is at 12:30. So when you finish your groups,